In the morning session, we are studying a little different topic than we cover at night. And I do this when I hold a seminar and when I have morning and evening meetings. And the reason I do this is that when we get down to the time of the closing meetings, Friday night and then on Sabbath, I bring the two themes together, or attempt to. And the study of Bible prophecy is this big. And each meeting, I can only take a tiny slice. And it's a lot like eating cheesecake. You can only eat a little bit at a time. But if you keep at it, you can eat the whole thing. Do you like that New York cheesecake, Kenny? I like it too. You just can't eat much of it. Yesterday, I talked about timing and how precision God is about His timing. And this morning, I'm going to continue in that theme, and I've got some wonderful things to share with you, and I'm going to attempt this morning to show you in this morning session how the 70 weeks of Daniel 9 are such a wonderful clock. A clock is simply an instrument for measuring time. Now, we've gotten real fancy with them, and we've put alarms in them and calculators and all other kinds of things, but basically, all a clock does is measure the passage of time. And would you agree with me that the passage of time suggests the continuation of time? See, Christians today are very skeptical about the imminent return of Christ when you really begin to talk about timing. Christians are quite happy with the word soon as long as soon means nothing. If you really mean soon is soon, then all of a sudden things begin to change. And I constantly run into Christians of all faiths who are very nervous about discussing time and timing. In the apocalyptic prophecies of Daniel and Revelation, there are 18 time periods, 18 prophetic time periods. God is a master of timing. With God, timing is everything. And He's given us clocks to measure time. I want to go to the overhead here for a minute and ask a few questions. Let's talk about the day. Here is our Earth. Here is the axle. And our Earth is spinning in a counterclockwise direction. And how long is a day? I'm impressed. That's right. A day is 23 hours, 56 minutes, and 4 seconds in length. And what makes up the remainder of the, back to the overhead, what makes the remainder of the 3 minutes and 56 seconds? It's the arc we travel in the period of a day, so that the world actually is back to where it started 24 hours ago. When God set a spin on the planet, He set it precisely to spin at 23 hours, 56 minutes, and 4 seconds. Because if He didn't do that, if He set it to spin exactly at 24 hours, 6 months from now, our days would be nights, and our nights would be days. God is so clever. What an engineer. So, in 23 hours and 56 minutes and 4 seconds, we travel approximately 72 million miles in our orbit around the sun. We're moving on. And our planet is spinning at about 1,000 miles an hour. You're doing 1,000 miles an hour sitting right there. No wonder it's hard to get up and get something done. This is sixth grade science. I'm sure everyone remembers these things. Right. Now, if I ask the question, what is the synchrony of the day? What would you say? Hello?
The day and the night?
I threw you a curve. The synchrony of the day is from evening to evening. Those of you who remember my drawing yesterday, I was showing the sun. I can't show the sun here on my, I've drawn the world too big. But you know how the daylight, the light comes to our globe, and so this side is in the light and this side is in the darkness. And as we spin into the light, this is morning, this is evening. And when God set up the day, it's synchrony, it's alignment, its beginning commences when? At sunset. And Genesis says repeatedly, and the evening and the morning were the first day. And the evening and the morning were the second day. And the evening and the morning were the third day. In other words, in God's clock, called the day, the synchrony of the day is from evening to evening. Makes perfect sense, because as we travel around the sun, sunset changes. Right now, you know, what's the longest day of the year? Well, they're all the same length, I know, but what's the longest daylight? What day? June 21. That's called the summer solstice, because we have the longest period of daylight. And what's the shortest daylight of the year? December 21st, the winter solstice. And then, and across from the solstice, we have the spring equinox and the fall equinox, where you have the Latin word equal night, equinox. And you have the same amount of darkness and the same amount of light twice a year, once in the spring, once in the fall. God set up some clocks so that man could measure time. And the first clock that he made on the first day. The evening and the morning were the first day. A day is a type of a clock. God has 10 clocks. I'm going to explain these to you. This is the first one. This is the lowest unit of measurement, is a day in God's clocks. Evening to evening. And the neat thing about God's clock, that no matter where you are on the world, if you're, you know, it's kind of funny, people who live on the equator are actually standing out like this. Have you ever thought about that? But when you're there at the equator looking at them, they look like they're upright. Have you ever marveled at how this works? And if you drop something at the equator, it doesn't fall down, it falls in. These things puzzled me when I was in the 6th grade. I'm still fascinated by them. Gravity. And you know, gravity, I remember when I took first class of physics, I couldn't figure out how something spinning at 1,000 miles an hour was pulling everything into it. Everything I saw spinning real fast was slinging everything off of it. How could that possibly be? Then I learned about Sir Isaac Newton. You know, the guy with the figs. Those apples, yeah, apples, that's it. The apples. He discovered, Sir Isaac Newton discovered that a pound of apples fell at the same speed as a pound of feathers. And from that, he calculated the coefficient for gravity, which is, if I remember right, 1/2 AT squared. Which means that an object falls at about 16 feet per second squared. It's funny when you go through school what sticks and what doesn't, isn't it? I forgot everything else. Okay, so the day clock. Everybody's clear on the day clock. Evening to evening, and no matter where you are on the globe, no matter where you are on this thing is about 8,000 miles across. It's about 25,000 miles in diameter, and it's spinning at about 1,000 miles an hour, and it's flying through space at about 72 million miles per day. And God did all this. You know, he could have made the world in 30 seconds if He wanted to. But God is deliberate and purposeful in everything He does, and He had a reason for doing what He did, and it's our joy to discover those reasons. Okay, so you know about the day. Now let's go to the next unit of time that God gave us. This is called the month. And the month. Here's the earth, and here's the moon. And God gave us the month clock, or the month clock, to measure the passage of time. That's all it does. And when the moon makes one complete circle around the earth, we have what is called a lunar month. And the time interval of a lunar month is 29 and a half days. Little, actually a tiny bit more. It's like 29 days and 12 hours and 23 minutes, something like that. A month begins in God's clock with a conjunction. Let me draw another picture. Here's the sun, here's the earth, here's the moon. And when there is alignment of these three bodies, that's called conjunction. And this is called, on earth, from our perspective, a new moon. If Alex here were to stand up, and he would be directly between me and the light, I couldn't see Alex's face because the light would be on the back of his head if there were no other light scattering around in here. You can't see a new moon. New moon is completely black, dark, no light striking the moon. And God did another neat thing. When He put the moon in its orbit around the earth, He set the moon up so that it rotates on its axis just fast enough so that the same side of the moon is always facing us. When you look at the moon, you're always seeing the same side of it. It rotates on its axis one time in a month. But that rotation is so slow that it's always facing us. The same side of the moon. God gave us the moon clock, and a month in God's calendar begins with a new moon. A moon that you can't see. Well, you say, now wait a minute, Larry, that doesn't make much sense. Why would God start the month with something you can't see? Well, actually, it's a more accurate clock that you can't see. Here's why. The ancients observed the moon, and they could tell a quarter moon, they could tell a full moon, they could tell the days of the month or the progression through the month by watching the moon. Just like they were as accustomed to looking at the moon as we are at our watches. And as a full moon is halfway through the cycle, and a full moon is a completely brilliant moon. A full moon can happen because the orbit of the moon around the earth, here's the earth, the orbit of the moon is actually elliptical a little bit, like this. I've exaggerated that so that you can get the point. And so as the moon goes around, this is the earth, a full moon is right here, and the sun, of course, is up here. And when the sun has fully illumined this face of the moon, you have a full radiating moon. Now, a new moon, depending on the way this ellipse is occurring, see the ellipse can occur like this too. The way this happens is that a full moon can occur as early as 13.91 days or as late as 15.55 days. This means that a new moon is halfway approximately through the cycle, not precisely, because the moon moves in an ellipse around the earth. The way that God set this clock up of counting off the months, with starting it with a new moon that you can't see, the ancients simply watch for the full moon, and then they calculate this, we're halfway. But because they kept record of time very carefully. In fact, when you read about the account of Noah, let's do that just for the fun of it. Let's go to the Bible here, and let's go to Genesis chapter 7. Right here. Notice how time is recorded in the days of Noah. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, shortly after a full moon. 17th day, see, month is new moon to new moon. On that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. At Noah's day, the time was very carefully calculated. The ancients very carefully counted time. That's why when we go to Exodus 12, verse 41, the Bible says, at the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. How precise is that? Can you get any closer than that? No. To the very day. The ancients did not lose the tracking of time. And I'll prove that later on as this begins to unfold, but I'm just trying to introduce you to these clocks. God gave the moon clock, and the ancients calculated the new moon. God had it done this way because you can't see it. And because you can't see it, that forced everyone to pay attention to the full moon, to the quarter moon, to the quarter moon. Now, the reason that I'm offering that God did this, of course, I can't honestly speak for God on all matters, on very much, in fact. There's a problem on a round globe in terms of reckoning time. Let me explain. When the moon is full, the people who live down here in Madagascar and the people who live up here in Greenland will see the same full moon on the same day, but 12 hours apart. They'll rotate into it. By calculating the new moon, everyone will arrive at the same day, regardless of where you are on the earth. If you wait to observe a new moon, or as the Muslims do today, the first crescent of the new moon, and as the ancient Babylonians did, then the sighting of the first crescent is dependent upon latitude and longitude, and the weather as well. If it's cloudy, you're not going to see it. Let me show you this text. New moon is mentioned, as you can see, several times in the Bible, 17 times in fact. And notice what God had promised Israel under Plan A From one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, all mankind will come and bow down before me, says the Lord. From one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, all flesh will come and bow down before me. So the new moon becomes a very important marker in time, and the only way to detect it is to study timing and to watch the moon. You've got to calculate it. And people calculating here and here and here would all be reaching the same day for the new moon. One more. So the synchrony of the month is the new moon. And one more clock, the year. In God's calendar, when does a year begin? God started His calendar and synchronized the year with the spring equinox, the first new moon on or after the spring equinox. This is kind of an interesting thing. The equinox is where we are at a position with respect to the sun, like the light that's shining there, where we have the same amount of light as the same amount of darkness. And the ancients learned to navigate by measurements that were established at the equinox. See, the heavens are all changing every night because we're moving around the sun. So they decided, and it became very apparent, that certain measurements made at the date of the spring equinox, that this is where the right ascension or the angle of things would be established. And so by taking a snapshot, if you will, of the heavens at the spring equinox, all references and all calculations about navigation and so forth were always made from this position, the spring equinox. Everything lines up at the spring equinox. God set up the year so that whenever the spring equinox occurs, you start January 1, New Year's Day in our equivalent, on the new moon that occurs on or after the spring equinox. Does that make sense to you? Okay, let's, this is the third clock. Now, watch this. This will confuse you for sure, but then we'll straighten it out. 12 new moons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 new moons equals 354 days. How long is actually a year? One trip around the sun is actually 365 and some change. Some months, some years in God's calendar are 12 moons, depending on when the new moon occurs. First one. Some are 13 moons, 13 months in length. God's calendar vacillates between 354 days and 384 days. The Jews called this 13th moon Adar second, because the 12th month was called Adar. So let me try to illustrate this one time. Let's draw a line here, and let's say this is from equinox to equinox. This is 365.24219 days. That's about 8 hours and 30 minutes. 365 days and 8 hours, let's say. Or 6 hours, excuse me. About 6 hours. Now, if the new moon, the first new moon, happened here, then we're going to go 29 and a half, 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 and so forth, until we get through the next equinox, and the first new moon that happens after the equinox starts the new month. Everybody understand that? It so happens that if a new moon happens very close to the equinox, you will get 13 moons in this time period. And then on the 14th moon, you start the new year because you've passed the equinox. The reason I am bringing this up is because this presents a very delicate problem that most Christians do not address. You might think, well, Larry, all of this, what's this have to do with the Bible? Well, it has a lot to do with the Bible, because in the Bible there are some prophetic time periods that are called a time, a times, and half a time. Do you know what a time is? One time around the sun. What is a month? One moon. One full cycle of the moon. Remember, the ancients thought the earth stood still. I mean, that was easy to prove. You could go out, the sun was over here. Now the sun's there. We went nowhere. The sun moved. Anybody could see that the earth stood still. Such is the beauty of empirical investigation, you know. But the problem is that how long is a time? How many days does a time represent? Because in Daniel 7:25, we read that the little horn power is going to persecute the saints for a time, times, and half a time. And we know that a time is a year. It's one time around for the sun. But how many days does that represent? Well, let me tell you what the ancients did. They knew, the Jews knew, that a year, that a time could be 354 or 384. They knew that. And so a time could be this or it could be that. But the actual use of the word time refers to something else. One time of around, see, this is the earth and this is the sun. The sun is moving. One time for the sun to go around is an arc of 360 degrees. And so it became the common, understood measure that one time was 360 days. Because it's kind of interesting, in one day, we move 1 degree. So that's how the 360 came to be. And the ancients, including the Egyptians, have used this type of geometry to express the length of a year. Now, the Egyptians had an entirely different calendar. Their year started in July. Theirs went from summer to summer. Their year began when they could see the star Sirius, named after their god. And everyone, though, still regarded a time as 360. And they regarded a month as 30. Although actually, it's not. In terms of days, a month is 30 because you can't resolve a half day in units of less than a day. So if you go 29 full days and you've got half a day left, like in 29 and a half days in a month, then you've got to count the 30th day as part of the month. Where the error comes in is that when you begin to add it all together, you've got more days than moons. But in general terms, a month was 30 days and a time was 360. The 360 was based on the the arc of travel 360 degrees. So God gave us 3 clocks in the very beginning. And we read this in Genesis 1. Genesis 1, the day, the month, and the year. Now, He also at creation gave us 1 more clock. And this clock is called the week. This clock is very strange. It's made up of 7 days. Why would God take 7 days and make something out of it? Where does the weekly cycle come from? Well, how is it that the whole world, for centuries, isolated from each other, not able to see and communicate with each other, how is it that the whole world has known what day of the week it was? When Columbus got to America, remember Columbus discovered that people were here already? I get so sick of hearing that Columbus discovered America. That's like saying I discovered Dayton, Ohio. When I drove up, there you were. People were here already. And they knew what day of the week it was. How do you explain that? In fact, research on this topic has proven an interesting point. That ancient civilizations, separated from each other by vast oceans and mountains and deserts and language barriers and what have you, all are aware of the 7-day week. It stems from nowhere else but creation. God, when He created the earth, He put a cycle of 7 days into effect. And man has tried his best to change it. After the French Revolution, the French threw out the 7-day week and created 3 weeks of 10 days. That lasted 6 years. Said, we can't live with this. 10-day week? Whoa, what a bummer. How about a 3-day week? With 2 days for the weekend. That'd be a little better. We could have 10 weeks every month. 3 days a week. Okay. When God created the week, He set up a pattern of 7 days, and so that every week that followed would be synchronous with what? What is the week synchronized with? No. Day 1. Good guess, kid. The alignment of the weekly cycle is established with the first day of creation. When I show you this calendar, and we're looking at the weekly cycle, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, this day 1 is aligned with day 1 of creation. And you say, how do you know that? How do you know that the weekly cycle hasn't been all goofed up and twisted and distorted and things aren't the way you think they are? How do you know that this is still synchronous with the creation? Well, that's a very interesting and that's a very valid question, and I'd like to demonstrate the answer for you. Let's go to the Bible and let's go to Genesis 2, verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the 7th day God had finished the work He had been doing, so on the 7th day He rested from all His work. And God blessed the 7th day and made it holy. He did this when? At creation. Before the Adam and Eve were the only people on earth at that time. They were created on the 6th day. Their first full day of life was a day of rest. He wanted them to get a head start on the coming week. How thoughtful of God. And so He made it holy because on it He rested from all the work of creating that He had done. Okay, so God sets up the weekly cycle. God sets up the holy day. He sets up the Sabbath, a day of rest, and He starts the time, the clock of weeks counting. Think of a week as the fourth clock. A week is 7 days. And the synchrony of the week is the first day of creation. The alignment carries straight across. Now, we're going to jump 2,500 years in one giant leap from creation down to the time of the Exodus. We're going to go to Exodus 16. And I think we'll check in at verse 10. Well, I'll tell you what. I think I'll back up here for a minute. I want to give you the story. You need to understand the story. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. You know what day they left Egypt? 15th day, first month. And so this is precisely what? 1 month later, and there's a full moon. We're in the middle of the month. The Exodus occurred with a full moon so people could see where they were going. And 1 month later, we're in the desert of Sin. I find that kind of interesting, the name of this desert. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And the Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Reminds me of when I was in school. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather up enough for that day. In this way, I will" what? I'm going to test them. I'm going to give them a little test and to see whether they will follow my instruction. On the sixth day of what? Of the week. On the sixth day, they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because He has heard your grumbling against Him. Who are we that you should grumble against us?" Moses also said, "You will know that it was the Lord when He gives you meat to eat in the evening, and all the bread you want in the morning, because He has heard your grumbling against Him." Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord. Then Moses told Aaron, "Say to the entire Israelite community, 'Come before the Lord, for He has heard your grumbling.'" While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. The Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. You tell them at twilight you are to eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." That evening, quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. Now remember, this is the desert, so the layer of dew is important. When the dew was gone, thin flakes, like frost on the ground, appeared on the desert floor. And when the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" Moses said to them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat." It's kind of funny to me, or not funny in the sense of humorous, but ironic. The bread that God gave came in the water, in the dew. Then the water left and the bread was there. I think it's kind of neat. It is the bread. And it became called, they named it after the Hebrew question, manna. Manna means, what is it? Let's have some what is it. Couldn't quite figure out what it was. This is what the Lord has commanded. Each one is to gather as much as he needs. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent. An omer, if I remember right, is a little less than a quart. A little less than a quart. The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much and some little. I like this sentence. The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some gathered little. And you see, the previous statement was, you gather just what you need. And when they had measured it by the omer, he who gathered much did not have too much, and he who gathered little did not have too little. Each one gathered as much as he needed. Then Moses said to them, no one is to keep any of it until morning. However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it till morning. That way they would have to get up early, get out there and get it. Because the sun would evaporate it. So you had to get up early to get your bread, your daily bread. In the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. Whether you realize it or not, we eat out of God's hand every day. Then Moses said to them, you're not to keep any of it. Some of them didn't pay attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning. But it was full of maggots and began to smell. So Moses was angry with them. Each morning everyone gathered as much as he needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. Now, watch this. We're 2,500 years down from creation. On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person, and the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, this is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake, and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning. So they saved it until morning as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. Kind of interesting. Then Moses said, eat it today, because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will not be any. Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather it, but they found none. And then the Lord said, how long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? The point I want to make in this little story, and we'll take a break here, is that when God set up the weekly cycle at creation, if there's any question in your mind that the weekly cycle got lost in the next 2,500 years, you can put that idea to rest, because God himself confirms which day of the week is the 7th for 40 years by withholding the manna on the Sabbath. Thus, the perpetuity of the weekly cycle is without question. God certainly knows which day of our week. And understand this. Earth time is unique in all the universe. There's not another planet that has time like we do. No one else spins at the same rate that we know of in the whole universe like we do. If we lived on Mercury, a year would be very different. If we lived on Mars, a year would be very different. If we lived on Mercury, a day would be very, very long. If we lived on Mars, it would be very, very long. Earth time is unique to Earth. Moons are unique, and our months and our weeks and our years and our days are all unique to Earth. This is the Earth time is special to Earth. And 3 of the clocks, the day, the month, and the year, are based on planetary motion, but the weekly cycle is based on knowledge. There is no evidence of a weekly cycle in all of nature. 0. You cannot determine what day of the week it is by examining anything and everything in nature. The knowledge of the weekly cycle conveys all the way from Eden to Eden. And as we look at the grand clocks and the great weeks and the grand weeks that God has made, you're going to see that God's timing, and the reason He put time here in the first place, is that He's trying to tell us a beautiful story. Well, let's take an intermission and we'll continue.